Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. In recent interviews, we've been learning about the seismic shifts that have reshaped the U.S. railroad industry since its deregulation in 1980. It's a topic of profound importance and immense complexity, and one that deserves to be explored from a variety of angles. Today, as we take one more pass at understanding the historical transformations that produced the moment we are now living through, we will hear much that echoes our recent guests, but in ways that substantially deepen and enhance what we have already learned. Our guest is Arnav Rao, transportation policy analyst for the Open Markets Institute. This conversation between Arnav and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer covers the full arc of the period with which we are concerned, from the passage of the deregulatory Staggers Act in 1980 to the ideologically slanted ways in which it was interpreted and implemented over the next 20 years, to the ongoing fight to preserve and strengthen what few levers of accountability remain for protecting communities and the public from the monopolistic predations of U.S. Class I railroads and the powerful Wall Street interests that control them. Here is Bill's conversation with Arnav Rao.
Good morning, Arnav Rao. Welcome to Reconnect America. We're very grateful that you decided to join us today. And we are hoping that we can have a conversation with you about Staggers and beyond. You're the policy analyst for the Open Markets Institute. Is that right?
Yeah, good to be here with you today. I'm Arnav. I work as a transportation policy analyst for the Open Markets Institute. We're a fair competition and anti-monopoly think tank based out of DC here.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in rail and rail policy?
Yeah, so a few years ago when I was still in college, I had a brief stint at Union Pacific Railroad where I worked with their government affairs and lobbying shop based out of DC. And that was a great experience. The people there were marvelous, super kind. I was there at Union Pacific during the time of the freight rail meltdown during the pandemic. And it kind of became apparent to me the way that the political economy of rail was structured, the way that we had kind of abdicated its public purpose and public regulation had not only allowed this meltdown to happen, but it kind of encouraged it. And that experience really helped inform my worldview as to what should be done regarding freight rail and public utility regulation in a larger sense. And it's what drove me to open markets here, where we focus on that public interest, public governance aspect of freight rail.
So we've been on some parallel tracks, if you will, in regards to both looking at the history of monopoly power and market control in the railroads and the importance of regulation for making sure that railroads were serving a public purpose as well as their private purpose. And recently, both your work and our work has intersected with the interference that the Trump administration has engaged in with the Surface Transportation Board. So it's an interesting moment where it's difficult to see whether or not there are guardrails against the private interests and protections of the public purpose of our railroads. I think for today, what we'd like to do is to go back to a really important juncture of when that public purpose and the structures for protection of the public purpose of rail were perhaps not just loosened, but almost nearly abandoned. I mean, not necessarily in statute, but in practice. For you, for a lot of us, it's obvious. I'm referring to the Staggers Act. Now, the Staggers Act is a very lauded deregulatory reform that most people involved in rail sing the praises of. And one of our people said it saved the railroad corporations and destroyed railroading. So there's a breadth of critique and or perspectives on the Staggers Act. But without editorializing too much about whether the Staggers Act was good or bad, why don't we start by just talking about what did the Staggers Act actually do? Do you want to take a stab at that? And maybe one thing I think that people would benefit from understanding would be the difference between common carrier obligations and contract carriers. So lead us where you will.
Yeah, that was one of the fundamental shifts of the Staggers Act, starting with the Interstate Commerce Act in the late 19th century. railroads were really governed as common carriers. And what a common carriage obligation meant was that railroads had an obligation upon reasonable request to provide reasonable service, and they had to treat customers in a non discriminatory fashion. They couldn't use their position as a bottleneck provider of an essential transportation service for private gain. And this common carriage obligation goes back, some sources cite, to the Code of Hammurabi. And what the United States recognized was that with such an essential part of our economy, we couldn't have railroads favoring one shipper or another because that would lead to inherently unequal outcomes in the economy. We don't want our economy to be based off of who can get the best deal with the railroads. We want it to be based off of who can produce the best products and services at the best prices. And what the Staggers Act really did was flip that on its head. It basically allowed railroads to now enter long term, shipper specific contracts that they were allowed to price discriminate between shippers, charging one price to one shipper and another price to another shipper, and providing different terms of service to different shippers. And what this really did was open the door to unequal service and unequal pricing. And it really reflected the pre Interstate Commerce Act time when Rockefeller Standard Oil received a 40-cent rebate for every barrel of oil it shipped, plus another 40 cents for every barrel shipped by its competitors. And they really used those rebates. And that was one of the big ways that Rockefeller was able to take over the refineries in Cleveland. There was a quote, Rockefeller's brother, Frank, to the other oil producers in Cleveland: if you don't sell your property to us, it'll be valueless because we've got the advantage with the railroads. So we can really use that power to squeeze you. And post Staggers, we kind of have a return to that world where all the big shippers, the UPSs of the world, the Amazons, the Walmarts of the world, have such an inherent advantage over the smaller shippers that it really creates this inequality in the economy. So that was one of the big changes that Staggers really produced. And the other ones I know we'll get into it a little bit more, but Staggers led to the ICC almost fully abandoning its pricing and rate setting obligations. One of the big parts of the Interstate Commerce Act and subsequent legislation was that the ICC had the ability to adjudicate what a fair transportation rate was. They had the ability to say, no, you're overcharging customers here, or you're pricing so low that you're doing this to drive other competitors out of the business here. So they had the ability to adjudicate both high and low prices. And now, with the passage of Staggers, we've kind of abandoned that entire paradigm. Another leg of rail regulation that was really important was entry and exit. To enter the market, you needed to affirmatively prove a transportation need, and to exit the market, you need to show that the service could not be sustained and that it was unprofitable and that there was no public need or public good. With the passage of Staggers, the process to abandon lines and spin off lines became essentially frictionless. And so the result was a radical transformation of what our freight railroad system looks like now. And then additionally, we really changed how lax we became with merger enforcement and antitrust enforcement. The ICC, and especially the Reagan and the Bush ICCs, kind of abandoned any sense of real merger enforcement in the public interest. We had 30, 40 class one railroads around that time, and now we have 6. And some of the biggest names in the system, the Penn Central and the Lehigh Valley and the Central New Jersey and the Reading and the Erie Lackawanna, all became Conrail and then eventually became Norfolk Southern and CSX. The big Union Pacific and Southern Pacific merger of the legacy systems of the Union Pacific and Western Pacific and Missouri Pacific and the prior Denver and Rio Grande, those systems all became consolidated throughout the time of Staggers and deregulation and post.
Right. And some of that obviously started in the 70s with the creation of Conrail and such. It has fascinated me how the rail system sort of transformed itself in that period and started to look very different. And I believe that We currently have about 140,000 miles of track in the US, and I believe we were closer to 200,000 route miles in 1980. I know that a good portion was abandoned, but another good portion was spun off to be these short lines. And my understanding is that there was about 8,000 miles of short line track in 1980 prior to Staggers. And now there's approximately 45,000 miles of short line track. So, do you have any insights in why they chose to spin off so many of their branch lines?
One of the biggest reasons why Class 1s decided to spin off their short lines was simply just to get rid of their labor agreements. In many instances, the spin offs of the short lines were predicated on there not being any labor organizing in the new entity. We saw that the ICC kind of completely abandoned its responsibility to enforce labor protective agreements on the new short line entities. They shortened the approval period for transactions to just 7 days. And after those 7 days, the approval of the sale was automatic. So interest groups didn't really have an ability to go in and demonstrate their opposition. I remember, example, CSX Transportation. They had employed approximately 220 employees on the lines in Western New York State to which it sold the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad. But when Buffalo and Pittsburgh rehired their workers, they only rehired about 160 people. The short lines ended up employing less than about 30% of the workers per mile, if you look at it on a per mile basis compared to the Class 1s. And so while the short lines employed fewer people than the Class 1s, they had worse job protection and benefits and wages. A lot of the traffic that was on the short line still ended up captive to the Class 1. So the Class 1 still reaped the benefit of the traffic that was on the short line, but they were able to get rid of those bargaining agreements and not have to pay. So it's another important instance of control without responsibility. We see this model proliferating throughout the entire economy, whether it's the franchise model or whether it's this Class 1 to short line relationship that propped up after the Staggers Act.
Well, that's fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing these stories that strike you as emblematic of this transformation. So, is there anything else that you'd like to say about abandonment or spin-offs?
I kind of want to drive home the point that the craze and the scale of the spin-offs and abandonments was really driven by the ICC's lax interpretation of what the statutory language actually was. The ICC played a huge role in intensifying the spin-offs. I mentioned the 7-day notice. They relieved new corporations for the need to obtain advanced approval of the acquisition. They really approved these sham transactions where these shell corporations were created just to acquire these short line tracks and set up operations. The short line phenomenon was advanced by the ICC's just lack of enforcement during that time.
You know, that is a really interesting point. And I think we should spend a little time digging into that because it's not easy for most folks to understand the difference between the ICC and the STB, but also to understand how the ICC changed, how the ICC took its role quite seriously, and then how, like, the Staggers Act didn't actually abandon all public interests. It still said to protect labor, to protect the environment, protect the public interest. So, do you have any insights into what happened at the ICC and how it became so lax and why it interpreted the Staggers Act as a total license for the railroad corporations to do whatever they wanted?
So the ICC, throughout its first 50 years, was a really revered institution. It was kind of held up as the perfect model of regulatory governance and fair mindedness and balancing the various aspects of regulatory policy. But starting in post 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s, there really was this push from both sides for a broader deregulatory policy. On the Democratic side, we had Ted Kennedy and Stephen Breyer pushing for airline deregulation. And in 1980, the Staggers Act was passed. And that wasn't simply a product of the Republican mind either. It was a bipartisan push. And I think the economic pressures at the time of stagflation and a slowing economy had people looking around to see what happened, what can we pin the blame on. And we came to the resolution that these institutions had become sclerotic and too slow to respond to the market reality. And there is some truth to that. The ICC was slow to respond to the proliferation of trucking, and they found it difficult to adjust rates commensurately. But by and large, that is a system that worked. And what we saw was that the members of the ICC were chosen by the administrations for their adherence to the deregulatory spirit. So even before it became letter of the law, ICC started deregulating in spirit. And we saw this especially with the ICC's regulation of motor carriers, because post Staggers, they didn't really have a mandate to deregulate motor carriers, but they kind of took the deregulatory spirit that the Staggers Act had and applied it across the board to motor carriers as well. So the commissioners of the ICC were chosen for their ideological adherence to deregulation at this point in ICC's history.
Thank you, because that explains a little bit of why the actual public interest protections that still exist in statute, even through Staggers for the national rail policy, seem to not carry the same weight as the mandate for deregulation. Could you speak a little bit more about consolidation post Staggers, or anything interesting that you learned about that?
Yeah, one of the big spooks of the time, and I think one of the big drivers for deregulation, was the bankruptcy of the Penn Central. It's hard to overstate how much of an effect that had on the public at large and on Congress and on regulators. So one of the big focuses post Staggers and post deregulation was a shift from public accountability focus to one where revenue adequacy was the primary goal for the railroads. And the ICC and the railroads were all saying at the time that how do we get the railroads to become revenue adequate is that we have to consolidate. We'll be able to find efficiencies in our infrastructure, and we'll be able to reduce the number of workers, and we have a bloated workforce and all of that. So I think the ICC took hook, line, and sinker the fact that revenue adequacy required further consolidation and the creation of national large rail systems. And to a degree, rail does demonstrate that large systems work well, but there is a stopping point to that. It can't just be a large system. It needs to be a large system that is governed in the public interest. And we abandoned both of those things at the same time. We allowed the systems to get large, and we abandoned the public interest part of regulation and instead focused on just, can we make these railroads revenue adequate?
Right. Well, thank you, because that is, I think, a really interesting point, and I think something we'll get to in future episodes. It's like we're not necessarily opposed to an integrated system, but the system has to be integrated in order to serve public benefits, not Wall Street. So moving towards that, trying to understand Wall Street's role in this. So we see that post Staggers, we get the very aggressive deregulatory work of the ICC, and then later on the Surface Transportation Board. And they obviously increased revenue adequacy by spinoffs and by abandonments and through consolidation and by opening up contracts rather than having the rate set by the regulator. So were there any turning points or moments when there was a diminishing returns on that sort of profit maximization and they had to shift to some perhaps more radical cost cutting? And what got Wall Street's attention? I mean, investors have always been involved in the railroad. So was there anything in particular where we start to see a yet more predatory approach from Wall Street towards the railroads?
Yeah. As you mentioned, Wall Street and railroad financialization has been a thing since the creation of the railroads. But we had a system created in the late 19th century and lasting throughout most of the 20th century that said we need to curb the excesses of the financial industry within railroads. And the way that we did that was we said railroads have to serve the public interest. There's rate regulation. There's only a maximum amount that shareholders can extract from the system. With the passage of the Staggers Act, what happened was we allowed for the consolidation of these railroads, which made it easier for big financial institutions to engage with the railroads. And we stopped enforcing the public interest obligations that railroads had. And so what Wall Street saw was, hey, we have a really vital sector here, a monopoly sector. And one of the primary goals of its own regulator is to ensure that they are making good revenues and good return on their investments. Yeah, of course we're going to do this. It's lightly regulated. There's very little risk there. And during that time, there's cheap credits and the deregulation of capital markets, which allowed for leverage buyouts. And in general, just the proliferation of cheap credit and the deregulation of the capital markets also allowed for the mergers and acquisitions waves that we saw after the passage of Staggers as well. And the long and short of it is the financial sector sees a essential industry that's lightly regulated, whose regulators are in fact wanting it to be revenue adequate. So it's an easy target for the financial sector.
Right. And could you take a stab at trying to place Staggers in the context of greater trends towards globalization and financial deregulation?
Yeah, I think Staggers came in the wave of the deregulatory spirit of the late 20th century. We not only saw deregulation in railroads, we saw it in airlines and trucking and banking and energy. And those all kind of dovetail off each other. And the unleashing of the financial sector and capital markets kind of allows that critically important sector to infiltrate and extract wealth from the other nationally important sectors as well. It's not only just railroads. We see this right now in airlines as well. And it all flows from the same river.
Is there anything that's been of a particular interest to you in the post-Staggers era in regards to activist shareholders and their involvement in continuing the trend towards profit maximization?
We touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's kind of undersold how much the activist investors' involvement is a result of the deregulation of Staggers and the other deregulatory policies in the late 20th century. What is one of the main tools that activist investors use to extract wealth from the railroads? Well, it's precision scheduled railroading. And precision scheduled railroading is only allowed right now because we gutted the common carriage obligation. We shifted towards contract carriage. If we had a robust common carriage obligation, if railroads weren't allowed to discriminate in price in terms of service, railroads wouldn't be allowed to cut headcounts and strip assets and reduce power, price gouge and close hump yards, right? They would be required to keep a base number of assets to serve their customers well. So the kind of direct through line from deregulation to the present activist investor scourge on railroads is I think, understated.
Could you go into more of that? Like, what have you seen in your research around examples of activist investors taking advantage of that?
The spread of PSR throughout the freight rail industry really started in 1993 with Hunter Harrison and the Illinois Central and the CN. When the CN acquired Illinois Central in 1998, they adopted Hunter Harrison's model. And for the better part of a decade, it kind of remained a Canadian phenomenon. But US activist investors were paying attention to this model of asset stripping and workforce reductions. And it really came to light in 2012 when Bill Ackman's Pershing Square launched a proxy battle at Canadian Pacific and installed Hunter Harrison as CEO there. And then the stock price tripled as assets were stripped and the workforce was reduced and reliability was reduced. And Wall Street kind of realized that PSR was a money machine. And again, PSR was only allowed because we allowed for deregulation and we stripped the railroads of their public interest obligations. And then in 2017, we see Paul Hilal and Mantle Ridge kind of use that CP playbook to seize control of CSX. He forced the board to hire an aging Hunter Harrison for hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation. And within months, CSX was abandoning service for hundreds of shippers to optimize the network. We saw this a few years ago now at this point with Norfolk Southern and Cora. And at this point, it's the fear factor. It's not only that we have come in here and acquired a notable stake, and Cora had a very tiny stake of Norfolk Southern. Just the threat of activist investors led Norfolk Southern to abandon dozens and dozens of intermodal routes and strip assets and hire John Orr as their chief operating officer, who's really committed to the precision scheduled railroading model. And again, there's that through line of fear and retaliation that management experiences because of fear of what these activist investors are going to do, which is only enabled by the abandonment of public interest.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you don't have to own giant portions of the company in order to have this sort of leverage. You mentioned it was a tiny percentage. And I believe the most recent one with CSX, somebody estimated, I think that it was 0.02% of the shares were owned by Ancora in order to put pressure on CSX to get rid of its CEO. Could you speak a little bit about that most recent activism?
Yeah, I think the recent CSX episode was a real blemish on the railroads. There was a report that came out recently about why Joe Heinrichs was fired. By most accounts, Heinrichs was a pretty good operator. He had started to bridge the long-standing gap between railroad management and railroad labor after the damage that had been done by PSR for so long. And what happened was that reportedly UP CEO Jim Vanna made informal outreach to Heinrichs about a potential merger, and Heinrichs at that point had declined. And as we all know now, Union Pacific merging with Norfolk Southern. And so the CSX's board and Ancora kind of saw that as a blunder on Heinrichs' part. Hey, I don't want to drive growth through just merger. I want to drive growth organically. That is seen as antithetical to what railroading is supposed to be at this point, which is kind of ludicrous. We don't want to drive organic growth. We want to drive growth through mergers is the strategy that Wall Street and that these boards want to take. And Cora said that his quote unquote botching of the merger was the final stake in his coffin and ousted him. So he was replaced by another executive who's known for his M&A expertise and is certainly more receptive to a potential merger with BNSF than Heinrichs was. So it kind of shows that the financial industry's final goal is just a transcontinental duopoly. We're no longer satisfied with regional monopoly. We can't drive earnings per share growth anymore, and so we need to move towards a national duopoly. That's what the end game is at this point.
Yeah, it strikes me as that we're in this moment where unless the regulatory system steps up and unless Congress clarifies its role and demands the public interest be reasserted, that the only interests that are being asserted and the fear factor that you mentioned is the power of activist investors, private capital, driving up stock prices and share buybacks, and the public is undefended. I wonder if in your research you've thought much about the role of stock buybacks and dividends and the cult of the operating ratio. Is there anything you'd like to say about that in this new system that we're in?
Yeah, I think the buybacks and the dividends are really the main extractive tool that Wall Street has used to mess up the railroad system. Marty Oberman, the former chair of the STB, mentioned a while ago that from 2010 to 2021, railroads spent about $183 billion collectively on stock buybacks, which is almost $50 billion more that they spent on their infrastructure. And their infrastructure spending isn't building new capacity. It's not how do we drive growth? It's how do we maintain what little we have so far? And one of your guests, Byron Porter, had a really interesting piece on his Substack that at one point, Wall Street wasn't just satisfied with the PSR-driven growth and earnings per share. They wanted these railroads to take out debt to satiate their need for stock buybacks and dividends. So we've kind of hit the point since the early 2000s where railroads were giving back to their shareholders with price increases and service cuts and cutting costs by cutting workers and stripping assets. And we've kind of reached the limit of that, I guess, is what some folks are saying. And what's the only method left we have to grow earnings is this transcontinental piece. And undoubtedly, this will be anti-competitive. The Surface Transportation Board and the ICC before it have kind of given up on their commitments to require open access to essential facilities. The ICC previously had conditions that if options were going to be foreclosed with shippers, that railroads had to maintain reasonable access to their facilities on commercially sound terms. That's one of the things that they gave up during the deregulatory drive, and they didn't have to do that. That wasn't in the law. And they made it really hard to challenge unfair rates. They piled on a bunch of exemptions for classes of commodities that they didn't have to do. And the role that the STB and the role that the ICC has played is what has driven the proliferation of buybacks and dividends and the prevalence of activist investors within the railroad monopoly problem.
Now, one of the things that Sasha's brought up for me is I'm curious how he sees PSR as distinct from other forms of cost cutting and wealth extraction that preceded it in the 2000s and part of the 2010s. So, what's unique about it in comparison to the consolidation, spin-off, private contracts? What's unique about PSR relative to those other things? And why do you think it emerged?
It's both a difference in kind and a difference in degree as well. So, of course, post Staggers, there was a huge reduction in the workforce from Staggers to about the turn of the century. We saw the workforce about halve from about 500,000 to about 250,000. So, layoffs and relocations have always been part of the railroad history post Staggers. And early 2000s to now, we also see about a fifth of railroad workers, or probably more in some estimates, have lost their jobs. So layoffs have always been a problem. Post Staggers, I think the emphasis was really on restructuring the railroad map to make it more advantageous to Class 1. So we really saw a reorientation from Class 1s being the ones that drove traffic growth to them just doing the hook and haul long distance travel. And that's how they started to improve their margins, get rid of the pesky little parts where you have to actually market yourself to customers and show why you're an advantageous mode of transportation and do the local collection. And instead, we'll just take the high margin traffic that we get.
So the way I interpret what you're saying is that relates to the emergence of emphasizing unit trains.
Yeah.
So the role of the unit train as a tool for profit maximization, but the unit train also allowed them, I believe, to lower rates. So rates did, post Staggers, rates had a trend downward, and then they pivoted to going up again. So I think it would be good to hear you speak again about this phenomenon of the profit maximization, what you were just talking about, and then keep going into this transition to how does PSR emerge as a yet further strategy for profit maximization?
So post Staggers, with the spinoffs and the abandonments, we really see a reshaping of the railroad map to where railroads are now just serving as the super highways, and the local feeder collection is all done by the short lines, who are still captive to the railroads in large part. And we really saw a shift in the type of traffic that railroads were taking on as well. They wanted to shift away from carload manifest type service, where we had to go in and sort these cars in a classification yard and a hump yard. We had to have a lot of touches towards unit trains, where we can just ship from A to B without having to reclassify it. And unit trains are really low cost for railroads. So that's where they saw the maximum potential to increase their margins. And what we saw was that railroads, for manifest carload traffic, ended up demarketing a lot of these folks and saying, hey, your margin just isn't high enough for us to serve you. It still might be marginally profitable, but it's just not profitable enough to meet our requirements. So the demarketing of merchandise traffic really hurt producers of things in America. What is merchandise traffic? What is carload traffic? It's the raw inputs that we need to drive industrial growth in America. Those are the types of things that move in carloads on trains. And the demarketing of that really hurt American industry. And what we saw instead was a reorientation towards unit trains, and the railroads kind of just became a conveyor belt for boxes coming in from China. We saw a pretty big growth in intermodal throughout this time period, and we saw reorientation again of the public purpose of railroads away from serving America and Americans and the heartland of America towards just hey, can we bring a box from the port of LA to Chicago or Memphis or St. Louis, right? So with deregulation, we again saw a shift in the orientation of what railroads were supposed to do. And prior to deregulation, what was the reason that these small American cities in Ohio and in Illinois and Buffalo, why were these cities big cities? Because railroad regulation required the railroads to serve these small customers wherever they may be at a reasonable price. Without that, now we have the ability to cherry pick who we want to serve, and that leads to a reorientation of the railroad maps. We're only going to serve the most profitable customers and the biggest corporations that are bringing in boxes from China, the Walmarts and the Amazons of the world. So in the early part of deregulation, that's really the type of margin boosting that we saw. With PSR, we saw a continuation, but we also saw a shift in kind of the type of cost cutting that the railroads undertook. And it really became, how do we take our current assets and do less with them? How do we strip more of these assets out? Railroads came to see idle assets redundancy as just extra cost. What are we doing with this spare locomotive? We don't need it. What are we doing with these spare crew members? We don't need them, right? And that asset stripping within the organization became a key focus during the age of PSR. So there was a difference in quality and a difference in degree as well. But in my view, PSR was never about real scheduling. It was never about running trains on time. Running trains on time, running a system on time requires redundancy. When you're at the airport and your flight is late because the crew isn't here, what makes for a scheduled takeoff at that point? When you have a spare crew to come in and run the flight for you, not cutting that extra spare crew, not cutting the cost of the plane that can substitute in for the late arriving plane. Real scheduling requires redundancy, extra locomotives, relief crews. But activist investors saw redundancy as waste. And the schedule of precision schedule railroading became a kind of a one-way street. If the shipper isn't ready the moment a train arrives, they're skipped. But if a railroad is late, oh, who cares, right? The shipper has no recourse. They can't do anything about that. And additionally, we knew that precision, quote unquote, scheduled railroading was the lie from the first part because the monster trains that they're building are too long for their existing sidings. When a 3-mile train breaks down or needs to pull over, it blocks the entire network. And you can't have velocity and fluidity when your assets are so bloated that they can't physically move past one another. So the emphasis on long trains kind of proves that PSR was never really about moving freight faster. It was just about spending less money to move it, even if it moves slower and less reliably.
That was very enjoyable to listen to. Thank you. Hey, Sasha, are there particular things that you're hoping that we're going to get Arnav to speak to that we haven't gotten to yet?
If you feel comfortable addressing this, I feel like one thing that we could zoom in on a bit more is this period from like 1995 to 2006 or so, where you have a whole bunch of things happen. You have the creation of the STB, and then you have 2 or 3 different mergers that all start reaching their limits in terms of scale, and they start causing these meltdowns. And then you have the STB imposing a merger moratorium and then changing the merger rules. And then in the aftermath is when you start to see the rates going up, the volumes going down, the stock buybacks going up as well, and the dividends, I think, start to grow a bit at that point too. So to the extent that you can tie that stuff together and address this period, that would be super cool.
Yeah, no, can do. The period post Staggers, we saw a real consolidation of a lot of those systems. 1980, we had about 40 Class 1 railroads. Today, we have 6. And that period from 1980 to the early 2000s, we saw a consolidation of many of the systems together to where we had just a few remaining systems at that point. We had the Conrail system, we had Norfolk Southern, the CSX, the Burlington Northern, the UP, the SP, and the Santa Fe. And we were kind of pushing up on the limits of these mergers. And during that period, 1995 to 2000, we saw a really big merger between the Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific in 1996, where the Union Pacific experienced a systematic meltdown. Trains were literally lost in the systems, tracks were blocked for hundreds of miles, and the economy really suffered at that time. And the SP was kind of seen as this railroad at the time that was very poorly managed, and management was incompetent and they didn't know what they were doing. And so the UP kind of took a very blasé attitude of course we can manage the system better than the SP when we integrated. And that didn't end up happening. We had a huge meltdown for a very, very long time. And that was followed up with the Conrail split. Conrail was divided up between CSX and NS, and it led to a pretty huge wave of gridlock and service failures in the eastern United States. Those two were the big ones, but there was a string of mergers that had happened since 1980, but really heightened post 1990, 1995, that highlighted the fragility of the new consolidated network. And that's one of the threats of a much larger system, is more fragility. And so in late 1999, BNSF and the CN announced that they wanted to merge. And the STB at this point, this was kind of like the tripwire to them. If BN and CN were allowed to merge, we would have this massive transcontinental giant, forcing the four remaining class ones into a final frantic round of defensive mergers. Stop me if this sounds familiar to what's happening right now. And in the STB's decision announcing this merger moratorium, they contemplate the fact that, hey, if we had allowed that merger to go through, we would have been left with only two transcontinental duopolies. Oh, the horror, right? And the STB finally admitted that the market couldn't handle this level of concentration without a total collapse of what remained of the common carrier system. And so in March 2000, the STB took the step of imposing a 15-month merger moratorium on all rail mergers. And during that time, the board claimed that it needed time to rewrite the rules because the old ones from the 1980s were inadequate to protect the public interest. And we wanted to ensure that this final round of consolidation, if it ever happened, would actually be in the public interest. So what ended up happening was BNSF and CN eventually called off their merger, saying that there's uncertainty and regulatory risk there. And so for the first time, the government, as a result of all the service meltdowns that had happened in the decade prior, finally said no and rewrote the merger rules to say that we need to enhance competition if there ever is a new merger. And that's kind of the context that this Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger sits in. And there are some problems with the STB's merger guidelines that they have there. Like I mentioned earlier, competition in these networked transportation industries cannot be the be all and end all, because more competition doesn't necessarily solve the service problems or discrimination problems that we see. But it was a good step towards stopping the almost complete monopolization. And I think it is really striking because one of the worst case terrible scenarios that the STB saw was that if we allow more mergers to go through, we will have this transcontinental duopoly system that would be terrible for the public interest. And somehow, about a quarter century later, we've kind of all forgotten about that hypothesizing.
Do you have any thoughts about the current Surface Transportation Board? What would you like to see from Congress or the Surface Transportation Board to reassert the public purpose of this critical infrastructure?
I think that there's a lot that Congress can do. I think one of the ways that shippers nowadays are kind of misguided, and especially the big shippers, are that they say that more competition will solve all the problems that railroads currently have. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. What was the reason that railroads were regulated in the first place? It was too much competition, arguably, in some places. too much competition led to destructive rate wars and led to railroads not being able to sustain good service. And there was a level of public interest that came from reducing competition, but still keeping a public's eye on rates and service levels. We realized that there was a public benefit there. And some of the measures to increase competition, like reciprocal switching, for example, or establishing bottleneck rates, it's good. It does help fix some of the problems that we have with our current highly monopolized system. But in terms of a long term solution, it just doesn't do the trick. What we need is a restoration of the common carriage obligation. And there's some good legislation in Congress with the Reliable Rail Service Act to do that. It helps with making it clearer to the STB as to here are the aspects that you need to look at when judging whether or not a railroad is following its common carrier obligation. That's really important. And there has to be a restoration of the previous stools that rail regulation sat on. A new regulator has to have the ability to determine what is a fair and unfair rate. And the STB has to use its current power to adjudicate prices. There's captive shippers who just have very little to no recourse right now. And STB needs to make their processes easier. And I know they have tried in the past, and that's been shot down by litigation, but we need to try again to make these processes easier for shippers, especially smaller shippers, to access. And Congress needs to restore the STB's ability to act on its own volition and strike prices down as unfair or too high. We need to restore common carriage. So this is an unpopular opinion with shippers, but contracts should not be confidential. Shippers have a right to know what their fellow shippers are paying for service. If Walmart is paying X much, I don't want to be put at a major disadvantage just because, Walmart is paying such low prices for shipping. And especially for small farmers and compared to big agricultural corporations, that makes a difference because rail transportation is a huge percentage of the final cost of goods sold. So we need to bring back the public tariffing that we had. And the STB finally needs to be significantly more rigorous than it has been in the past with merger enforcement. And we already have a really bad monopoly problem in the railroad industry. Do not make it worse by reducing options further. CPKC should not have happened, and it did anyway. But there's a really big opportunity now for Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern and the STB to finally set its foot down and say no more. So that's another thing that the STB really needs to do. So we need to restore the entry, exit, rate fairness, and non-discrimination and antitrust roots that the original Interstate Commerce Act and the regulatory paradigm of the 20th century really.
Yeah, it's interesting because certainly the Reliable Rail Service Act seems like the next step towards reasserting public interest. It's difficult to create a reciprocal switching rule that mandates railroads to open up their tracks if they're not being competitive in their service. But if there's no standard of service, then there's no way to judge whether they're being competitive or they're providing adequate service. Well, we haven't really had anybody else besides our own editorial voice speaking to the Primus firing. And it seems to me like you have already spoken about this in other contexts, and you have more leeway to speak to it than shippers or others can who don't want to piss off the current STB. But could you speak to the illegal firing of Robert Primus and what that maybe signifies to you in terms of interference from the executive and independence of the STB and its ability to hold public interest and keep its independence during this proposed merger?
Yeah, 100%. The illegal firing of Robert Primus, and it was illegal, is extremely concerning for the STB's ability to maintain decisions free of influence from the White House. We've already seen this White House stick its nose where it should not be sticking it. And the firing of Primus is just another indication that we are going to allow this to go through if it fits our favor, right? We're going to allow this to go through because it fits our favor. Union Pacific has donated to our ballroom. So we're going to allow their merger to go through. It's pretty brazen how openly corrupt that is. And that's on the administration's part. The remaining STB members, while I respect their collegiality, they've shown signs of concern that they can't remain impartial. And how could they, right? When their colleague has just been fired by Donald Trump for who knows what. Of course, Michelle Stoltz is going to say, I work at the pleasure of the president. Of course, Patrick Fuchs is going to say that Democrats are blocking the appropriations bill during this shutdown. He sent a letter to the STB staff saying that Democrats are responsible for this shutdown. It's very out of line with what an independent regulatory agency is supposed to do. It's 100% cause for concern that their independence won't be upheld. And it makes me question how seriously, thoughtfully, and rigorously this merger will be evaluated. I know that a lot of them will do a great job in evaluating it, but it cannot be said that it'll be done free of political influence, because it simply won't. The one board member who sought to block the previous merger was just removed for political reasons. That is going to have a chilling effect on the remaining members.
Well, we have just a few more minutes, but one of the things I'm wondering, Arnav, is the whole system flawed from the beginning? Like, are the very origins of a system that is built by private industry to deliver private profits able to adequately deliver on its public purpose as national infrastructure? And I'm really trying to see a way forward. Now, obviously, the regime of regulatory rules that were in place for a number of years, as you said, it seemed to be working, but it wasn't really working because it allowed the public to subsidize the competition. It managed to get through these various periods through different bailouts, whether it be World War I or whether it be 1970s, where we relieve it of the duty to move passengers, or Staggers, and then all of the various things we've talked about post Staggers. And it seems like we're still trying to figure out a way to let private corporations run a public infrastructure. In taking so much time to do this, we're causing so much public harm by the use of trucks for our long haul freight, et cetera. It feels like maybe we're coming to a final conflict where we really just need to say, fuck it. Fuck it. This did not work. It doesn't work to have private corporations running critical national infrastructure. We need to break up the railroads. We need to vertically separate infrastructure from operations and have the public run the infrastructure as a steel interstate, and let public and privately owned operators competing on service and have rates set again. This is a bit of a rant, obviously, but I'm just trying to think if there's, what the hell do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, no, that resonates, because ever since the regulatory paradigm was created, there has been this tension of how do we balance public regulation with the need for private corporations, which are running the infrastructure, to continue existing. And there has been this balance to draw. That's the way that the United States has done it for a lot of these essential infrastructures, whether it be railroads, whether it be utilities in a lot of cases. But I do think what you're saying is important, because some of the biggest cases of success have been when the public has realized we have this essential infrastructure, we need to take control of it and run it in the public interest. If you look at the spread of the electrical utilities in the early 20th century, the big corporate utilities and their holding companies didn't want to serve rural America. And what really got rural America electricity was the proliferation of co-ops and municipal utilities, where governments took the initiative and built out those lines. And FDR came up with the big stick and threatened private utilities with the option that the government could take them over. And I'm not an energy utility expert, but I think something along the same vein in railroads will be needed. We're coming up on the limits of what a privately owned national infrastructure can do. And the public either needs to say, hey, we are going to take charge right now, or hey, if the railroads can't keep up the amount of service we need and the level of service we need at reasonable, non-discriminatory rates while treating their employees fair, we have the public option to come in and take you guys over and run it in the public interest. And we've come close to doing it a few times in the past, and it's shown that public governance and public operation can work. And I do think that we are coming up on the limits of what a privately owned rail infrastructure can do for the public good in the United States. And this merger highlights it even more. These corporations aren't interested in growing organically and converting more freight from trucking to rails, which is objectively public good. We don't want to take the CSX approach of, hey, let's try to at least make steps towards improving relationships with our labor friends and try to drive growth organically. No, we just want to extract more and more from the system and drive more buybacks and dividends. And we've come to the natural limit, and the public and Congress and the STB really needs to reckon with what models have worked in the past that have really driven innovation and have driven public interest governance. The public ownership of shipyards really helped create Liberty ships, which helped drive us to victory in World War II. We were able to create new innovative ship designs because of public ownership. And if the public takes that step with the railroads, I think we will be able to see some truly new, innovative way to drive freight growth and to drive the industrial growth that we want to see happen in the United States. So it's a point well taken, and it's a point that I hope everyone in important positions will listen to.
From your lips to God's ears. All right. Arnav Rao, it's just been a great pleasure. You've been incredibly generous with your time with us, and we really appreciate that. Thank you. And we look forward to staying in touch and keeping building this work together.
Yeah, of course. It is a pleasure being here. I'll take care.
That was Arnav Rao, Transportation Policy Analyst for the Open Markets Institute, in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. This conversation was edited for clarity and brevity by August Moore and me, Sasha Lenko. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.